Our second reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up, he saw a large crowd coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one of them to get a little bite. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass on the place, and so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. A break in the action and a restart. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the Sea of Capernaum to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land towards which they were going. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. I'm sure somewhere over time you've heard that old statement, knowledge is power. It truly is an old statement. The phrase knowledge is power is often attributed to Sir Francis Bacon from his sacred meditations back in 1597. Now, as a retired academic, I take more heart in the use by Thomas Jefferson. He used this phrase in multiple occasions, primarily related to higher education. One of his letters, he said, knowledge is power. He also said, knowledge is safety, and knowledge is happiness. And to an engineer's delight, he spelled knowledge with no W and no D. So I can get away with that too. During the 18th and 19th century, the age of modernity, when rapid advances in science, arts, and technology and business occurred, it was often assumed that if a person had the right data and the correct information, that he or she could objectively use that knowledge to make the world a better place. Knowledge provided power over the world, and when used objectively, this power seemed limitless and good. Today, I'd contend there's a different dynamic. Today, knowledge, or at least information, seems ubiquitous. With the advent of the information age, knowledge is everywhere. Today, knowledge is often characterized as neutral, almost pervasively passive, not value-laden as it might have been historically. Want to know what the weather is going to be for the Olympics this week in Japan? Well, get out your smartphone. You can get to that. Want to know what the stock numbers are for this day or this hour or this minute? Jump on your computer. You can get that. Television continues to be a purveyor of knowledge. You can channel surf around and get lots of different types of knowledge. You get documentaries of World War II, reality shows of building cabins in Alaska, all kinds of sporting events. During the newscast, you even have words scrolling across the bottom of a totally different story, which is maddening to me. I cannot handle that. I can't multitask, I guess. But in the face of all this knowledge coming at us, access to knowledge is no longer giving a competitive advantage and power it once did. Now, with the knowledge available, it's not uncommon to find paralysis instead of empowerment. What do you do with all this information, all this knowledge? What do you do when faced with a crisis, personal or community? Could be as global as a famine and epidemics in Africa. Could be like the drought in the West. Or could be a local thing as whether or not people are vaccinated in our community and what do we do about it? There's a very real temptation to face so much knowledge, too much information, to just give up and passively ask, well, what can I do? Rather than moving to action, we throw up our hands and give up, walk away. Let's literally or figuratively use as an idea. We can move over to HGTV, maybe follow another lottery winner as they find their dream home on the lake. Substitute pursuit of shelter may be more appealing than pursuit of answers to problems in our real life crises. But this substitution for empowerment through knowledge becomes escape from reality and does not empower, but perhaps just entertains or just distracts. However, we should not let our current day conditions blank out our reading for today. Beyond the distractions of our current day, we need to recognize the Gospel of John we read from is all about knowledge is power and is about understanding the power of Jesus. It is about God incarnate, God with us, and it is about our knowledge of the way, the truth, and the life that we can access. It's a very different knowledge yet than science and facts. It's a knowledge that refuses the conventions of objectivity and the scientific control we love so much. It is not knowledge with high entertainment value, not knowledge that may create a relaxing experience. Knowing the events of Jesus' life grounds us in a knowledge of truth. In our Christian tradition, notes Parker Palmer, truth is not a concept that works, but an incarnation that lives. By that, he means truth in Jesus is personification of God, making God personal so that we can live out what that brings to us in life. Jesus' life and teaching embodied the knowledge of truth for us. In our text we read today from John, we have two miracle stories. And Robert Hooch points out that these stories give us Jesus on two planes, the theological plane and the human plane. It describes both the theology of Jesus, the theology meaning the nature of God, and the reality of the human condition simultaneously and without contradiction. This first miracle story, the feeding of the multitude, addresses the human temptation to shrug one's shoulders in the face of need. It shows the finitude of human knowledge as compared to the power of Jesus. In this story, in this first story, it's really grounded in the Old Testament feeding stories. The story that Ruth read for us earlier about Elijah is just such a story. A man doing his duty to God brings the first fruits of the harvest to the temple, 20 loaves of barley bread. Now you need to know that barley bread is the bread of the poor people. This is not a rich man bringing his extras. This is a poor man bringing his first fruits. God takes this offering of the poor farmer and uses it to feed many. In today's first story in the New Testament reading, Jesus has been so successful in his preaching and healing that even when he retreats to a mountain, a large, very large crowd follows. He sees what his disciples will see, an overwhelming need and few resources. Jesus asks the disciples a very practical question that tests the limits of their knowledge. Where are we to buy bread for these people? Now, note, he does say we as the disciples in Jesus are in this together. John, the author, reassures us that Jesus already knew the answer, but wants to set the disciples up for a deeper learning. When faced with this question, the disciples speak from their very practical based earthly knowledge. Philip scans the crowd. The bleak truth, 6 months' wages would not even buy enough bread for each one to get a bite. That's Philip's very practical assessment. Andrew, kind of at the end of his rope, I can see him there kind of kicking the dust, adds, well, they have a young fellow over here with 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 dried fish. Not that that's going to go very far. At the end of their human knowledge, beyond their exasperations, stands Jesus. There stands Jesus and his love. He does not give them an academic lecture on the power of the divine spirit. He does not even ask them to go check the scrolls back in the temple, which would have been the first century equivalent of Googling it. He simply tells the disciples, organize the crowd. Then Jesus took the bread and having given thanks, gave it to the people. Note here, John has Jesus feeding the people himself. He did the same with the fish. All ate as much as they wanted. Then, being the frugal person he was, says when the people had eaten their fill, he said to the disciples, gather the leftovers so nothing is wasted. Then they went to work and filled 12 baskets with leftovers from the 5 barley loaves. I'm sure they took them to the local food pantry. Okay, what did the people see? They saw a miracle that filled their stomachs and their immediate need. They were convinced by the demonstration of power that this person was the true Messiah. In contrast, what did the disciples see through this experience? And what can we see through it? Could we see a deeper meaning Jesus wanted to convey? Could we see the end of human knowledge is the beginning of love's knowledge, knowledge of God, and that this God can feed a multitude with much left over. Our world is filled with people who have grown accustomed to facing overwhelming need. Our lives can feel as though they are filled with overwhelming challenges and needs, whether they be physical or emotional or spiritual or all 3 combined. It is easy to look at the sheer magnitude of the need and compare that to what the perceived small resources are at our disposal and ask the same question Andrew did. What, with a sense of defeat, what is it I have, we have among so much need. Yet remember, by Jesus, the hungry people were fed. I'd remind you in each week in our prayers of the people, we place before the Lord the great needs of humanity as well as our own personal needs. We pray for leadership and community. We pray for the sick and the caregivers. We pray for those who have died. And we pray for those things closest to our hearts. Yet we, like the disciples, are only human. We may find echoing back in our minds that statement of resignation. Whatever we have, Lord, is not enough. Remember, as this text points out, that not enough is not the final answer. Jesus wanted the disciples to know, wanted the people to have their opportunity to see his love is there to see through the very end of time. It may have been a miracle that the 5,000 were fed, but the single plentiful meal was not the message. They would get hungry again. They would have many needs in the world. Yet the message of Christ's love is that what goes on beyond and goes beyond our human understanding in time and space. This text closes with a couple of incidents that are warning to those who wish to take worldly control, want to manipulate based on knowledge of God's power. The Message translation says it thusly: the people realized that God was at work among them in what Jesus had done. They said, "This is the prophet for sure, God's prophet right here in Galilee." Jesus saw their enthusiasm. They were about to grab him and make him king. So he slipped off and went back up the mountain by himself. Later, the disciples, rowing back across the lake, caught in a storm, maybe 3 or 4 miles out, saw Jesus walking on the water quite near the boat. They were scared senseless, but he reassured them, "It's me. It's all right. Don't be afraid." In no time, they reached land. Jesus' refusal to be taken by force and made king, and his refusal to allow the disciples to take him into the boat, make clear that the power and love of Jesus is not a concept that works at the whim of a human call. Yet the message is incarnation, the embodiment of God that lives and works both among us and through us is very real. God's love working in us and through us. Thanks be to God.